This year is the 10th anniversary of the iPhone. And in fact, it's widely expected that in 2 days, Apple will unveil a new phone, which is supposed to be the Jesus phone or a paradigm shift or something. Who knows with Apple? They hype everything up and they cause so much commotion with every little incremental change that they make to their products. Most of us sitting in this room may remember what phones were like before they became these slabs of glass that we tap and we swipe all the time. And if you dare to pick up one of those devices from back then, you will see how elegant a solution that slab of glass is. Before the iPhone came out, I had an HP phone. It was a Windows phone, and it had a detachable keyboard and a stylus. It was like they couldn't decide what input method would be the best for this phone. So they just kind of threw all the input methods at it. You could type on it, you could stylus it, or you could tap it with your finger. As far as I know, I'm the only person that bought that phone. I've never seen it again. I've never heard of anyone who bought that phone. And if you look back at those phones and, those flipping, sliding, clicking phones, you start to understand something fundamental. Making the phone about the screen and about the user experience rather than the input method and the function of the phone was the right choice. Making the phone simpler was the right choice. It is well known that the now deceased Steve Jobs had an obsession with keeping things simple, making sure that all his products have clean lines and clean colors. And it is a design ethos that permeates Apple stuff today. Now, lest you think that I'm an Apple fanboy, I know very much that Steve Jobs arrived at his products through a strong insistence on his point of view and even bullying of his coworkers and his subordinates. And it's a well-known fact that he was a bully and a little bit of a tyrant. And somehow he managed, through all his techniques of persuasion or bullying or whatever, to get these engineers to make a product and to resist their impulses to make it more complex. Make the design simple. You see, a good design, if you get it right, a good design doesn't get in the way. It distills something that is really complex into something that is very simple and makes sense. And often the best design of something is usually the simplest design of it. Often the best, most elegant solution is the simplest solution. I remember sitting in our living room. I didn't buy into the iPhone immediately. I was still a fan of my HP phone, and I didn't want to give it up. I didn't want to think that it wasn't as good as the iPhone. And I saw my daughter pick up an iPhone and start to swipe and poke around it. She was only 2 years old at the time. And she figured it out, just like that. I was like, well, I guess they're not spewing hyperbole when they talk about this. Now, Apple has sold millions and millions of these machines, and they're really complex. They have lots of microprocessors. They have millions and millions of lines of code driving it. But in that moment, watching my daughter just poke and swipe around on the thing, I realized something simple. It was a good design. It was a good design. And how we know it is a good design is that now every single phone, Windows, Android, those are the two other competing operating systems, all of the other phones have mimicked that design, haven't they? If you want to find a phone that's not a slab of glass, that has an actual keyboard or flips, it's actually quite difficult to find one. Everybody has gone to this slab of glass phone. It was a good design. It was a good idea. Good design doesn't get in the way. It distills a really complex thing, complex nature of a product, into something that is utterly simple and makes sense. Let's look at every creature on this earth. They run, they walk, they swim, they fly with such ease and such grace. Now, look at how long it took men to figure out how to fly something. The first people who tried flying must have thought, how hard can it be? I mean, look at the birds. It turns out it's really hard to achieve flight. Yet birds do it so effortlessly. All around us, there is a simple elegance and beauty and grace to almost every aspect of natural life. And our greatest science is unfortunately never ever going to be able to replicate the ease of this nature around us that God has created. Allow me to get geeky for a minute. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the term DNA. If you break DNA down to its essential elements, it's hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and a little bit of phosphorus. Now, I studied chemistry quite a bit in a previous life. And if you remember your periodic table, hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, phosphorus, those are very simple elements. The molecules that make up the building blocks for the helix molecule that we call DNA are very simple. The actual DNA helix molecule is very simple, and yet out of that simple design, all of natural life has been created. All of plants and all of animals have been created from this very simple, elegant molecule. But that's the beauty of this God design in which we inhabit, is that the simplest designs are the ones with the most grace and sophistication. If you make something more cluttered, more complicated, you make it less accessible. If you make it simple, you make it elegant. You make it more user-friendly. And so why would I start this message talking about simplicity? Well, it's because it is one of the ideas that is at the core of this thing that we're trying to do called Pivot 613. It is one of these things that I've tried to convince myself of personally, and that I hope that I would pass to you as a lesson. We need to talk about living simply, and we need to talk about simplicity, because we've come to believe that if we're to build that thing, grace, mercy, and love first, a no-fear zone, a community of grace in our city, that we have to put simplicity at the core of it. When Jesus did his ministry among the poor, when he walked this earth, when Jesus did his ministry among the people of his time, he did it mostly among the poor in his time. And we like to think that there is a big difference between people that are poor and people that are wealthy, but there actually isn't. The wealthy people and the poor people both clutter their lives up with stuff. You go to a castle in the wealthiest country, you go to a shanty in the poorest country, and you'll find the same thing. We fill our houses up with crap. It's what we do. Even a homeless person walking around on the streets of Ottawa or anywhere in the world will usually have a cart full of stuff. That's what we do. It's kind of the universal to humanity. And no matter where we are on the financial scale, we see it all the time. We want more. We're collecting more. We're distracted by it. And so you can imagine that Jesus, who was known to work miracles, was regularly approached by people who were asking him to make their situations better. Give me more stuff. Fix my life. Help me to make $1 million, blah, blah, blah. And so much of Jesus' teaching was trying to retrain their brains about something crucial. He was trying to help them to see that if they could live lives that were simple, lives that were not focused on stuff, that they could experience life on completely different terms. Let's read it together. Matthew chapter 6. It says, "Don't hoard treasure down here where it gets eaten by moths and corroded by rust, or worse, stolen by burglars. Stockpile treasures in heaven where it's safe from both moth and rust and burglars." It's obvious, isn't it? The place where your treasure is the place where you most want to be and end up being. Your eyes are windows into your body. If you open your eyes wide in wonder and belief, your body fills up with light. If you live squinty-eyed in greed and distrust, your body is a dank cellar. If you pull the blinds on your windows, what a dark life you will have. You can't worship two gods at once. Loving one God, you'll end up hating the other. Adoration of one feeds contempt for the other. You can't worship God and money both. If you decide for God, living a life of God worship, it follows that you don't fuss about what's on the table at mealtimes or whether the clothes in your closet are in fashion. There's far more to your life than the food you put in your stomach, more to your outer appearance than the clothes you hang on your body. Look at the birds, free and unfettered, not tied down to a job description, careless in the care of God. And you count far more to him than birds. Verse 27, has anyone, by fussing in front of the mirror, ever gotten taller by so much as an inch? All this time and money wasted on fashion, do you think that it makes much difference? Instead of looking at the fashions, walk out into the fields and look at the wildflowers. They never primp or shop, but have you ever seen color and design quite like it? The 10 best dressed men and women in the country look shabby alongside them. If God gives such attention to the appearance of wildflowers, most of which are never seen, don't you think he'll attend to you, take pride in you, do his best in you? What I'm trying to do here is to get you to relax, to not be so preoccupied with getting so that you can respond to God's giving. People who don't know God and the way he works fuss over all these things. But you know God. You know both God and how he works. Steep your life in God reality, God initiative, God provisions. Don't worry about missing out. You'll find all your everyday human concerns will be met. Give your entire attention to what God is doing right now, and don't get worked up about what may or may not happen tomorrow. God will help you deal with whatever hard things come up when the time comes. I love this passage of Scripture. Jesus is basically trying to warn his listeners against the temptation to clutter up their lives. Even from Jesus' time, there was a cultural narrative that caused people to want to focus on temporary treasures. I don't think that he's just pulling these words out of thin air. There was a cultural narrative that made people blind and greedy and distrustful, fussing about temporary, trivial stuff. And so Jesus is basically asking his listeners, and he's shouting at us through history, to realize something completely different. We do not have to unnecessarily clutter up our lives. We do not have to buy into the cultural narrative. We need to simplify. We need to go against the grain. We need to tap into the simplicity and contentment that comes from a life that is lived for God. Look at it again. Instead of looking at the fashions, walk out into the fields and look at the wildflowers. They never primp or shop, but have you ever seen color and design quite like that? The 10 best dressed men and women in the country look shabby alongside them. Wow. I think that this passage is so poignant in our world today. Now, I'm not trying to make you feel bad for buying yourself something nice from time to time. And in my opinion, I don't even think that this is what Jesus really meant by his words. I think that what he's trying to say through his words is simplify. So then people ask me all the time when I speak on this subject. So all you're saying is I need to go home and throw away stuff or give away the excess stuff, clean out my closet, stop focusing on stuff, right? Kind of, but not really. I think there's something a little bit deeper, something of greater significance. You see, for most of us, the call to the simple life stops with us. The problem with stopping with us is that it is based on the erroneous thinking that on our own, we're able to permanently fix our lives, basically save ourselves. This is the misguided hubris of the human condition that keeps us bound in a spiral of shame, because we are not able to change our futures or the futures of people around us, no matter how hard we try. It is a tough truth that we must accept. That is why we say that we need a Savior, because on our own, we are powerless to change our lives in the ways that we want, in the ways that really matter. So, simple living is much more than an attempt to change our mindset on our own. Simple living is about changing the focus and changing the faith of our lives. Right in this passage that we read, right in Mark chapter 6, Jesus gives the answer. Would you look at verse 25 again with me? It says, if you decide for God, living a life of God worship, it follows that you don't fuss about what's on the table at mealtimes or whether the clothes in your closet are in fashion. There's much more to your life than the food you put in your stomach, more to your outer appearance than the clothes you hang on your body. Did you see that? Living simply does not start by throwing away your stuff and cleaning out your closets. Living simply goes further than willpower. It starts with living a life of God worship. Now, make no mistake about it. A life of God worship will clean out your closets. It will. It will make you less focused on stuff. But it does this by changing the perspective of the stuff around you. You won't really see it as clutter. In my life, the way that I've started to see it is these are love gifts that God has given me and put in my hands so that I may bless the world with them. I have been blessed to bless people. I have these things to actually give them away. If we're truly honest, most of us are living for ourselves. We're living lives that are in service of our selfish desires. Now, we obviously have varying levels of what that actually means for us, but the 80 or 90 years that the strongest of us will live are extremely temporary. And at the back of our minds, we know that time is running out. If you are living a life that is focused on yourself, there is something about having a countdown clock over your life that causes you to be more frenetic and to focus on trivial stuff rather than focusing on what matters. And because all of us humans live with a countdown clock, we do. One day we are going to pass on. And because of this, we have a tendency to live lives that are so focused on temporal stuff. And we run around like chickens with our heads cut off. And we end up making our lives more complicated than making them simple. In order to find the simple, we have to take the focus off of ourselves. We have to find a focus that is better than our temporal selves, that is bigger than our temporal selves, that is more meaningful than our temporal selves. We have to find our focus in God. God who never changes. God who stays the same through the ages. Because when we find our focus on God, our bodies fill up with light. We no longer fuss about what we eat. This is what Jesus says. We no longer fuss about what we will wear. Not because we're white-knuckling it, but because our peripheral vision is filled with something much more magnificent, much more eternal. More to that, in God, we start to see that we are not temporal beings. We are eternal beings. And with that perspective, the countdown clock goes away. We no longer have to fuss about the temporary things and run around scratching to fill our lives with stuff because this is all we have. No. We no longer have to fill our lives with what Jesus says. It can be eaten by moths or corroded with rust or stolen by burglars. We don't have to do that. And so, at Pivot 613, This simple focus on God is what I'd like to speak to you about. It has to become the defining characteristic of who we are as a congregation and as individuals. I hope that you hear me this afternoon and hear what I have to say. Because the temptation of our day and age is to fill up our lives with stuff. It is. Let's be honest for a minute. In Ottawa, if you are not busy with something, your associations will perceive you negatively, won't they? The pressure is to be busy or to make a show of being busy. In addition, there are many things that are clamoring for our attention, aren't they? And with most of these things that are clamoring for attention, there's not really an insidious ulterior motive, no. They were started to fill a void. So either we're busy on purpose or we're busy by accident. And in the end, all that we've achieved is that we've created really cluttered lives. And in the process, we start to miss out on what is most important. And I'm persuaded that the most important thing is to hear the voice of God. Something that is of great importance that we end up crowding out every time we fill up our lives is that we miss out on cultivating the relationships around us that are most important, don't we? We miss out on gathering together in fellowship and in worship and to encourage one another. We miss out on studying and learning what the Bible has to say. We miss out on opportunities to serve our communities and people that are less fortunate around us. If your life is not simple, you just don't have space or room for these things that are of much greater importance. And so this afternoon, the invitation to you is to consider something different than what our culture says. We're challenging ourselves to a simpler life. Why? Because crowded schedules and cluttered lives squeeze out the opportunity for God to speak to us and for God to use us. Simpler lives free up more of our resources, our time, our finances, our strength, everything to be used to love God and to serve others. You guys know this. At Pivot 613, we have like 0 programs. And there's a reason for this. We're very intentional. We've placed a high value in keeping things simple. It would be so easy to fill up the schedule and find things for you to do and to be here 7 days a week. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted to build a congregation that was different, that made room for you to be out in your community and for God to inspire you in ways to reach the community around you. So a community of grace, in my opinion, is not just one in which God's love permeates, but it's also one that has legs, that shows love and grace to the people around us. And if we choose busyness over simplicity and listening and love, what will end up happening is that we will speak very eloquently about helping people, but we'll never get around to doing it. So the invitation this afternoon is to a life of simplicity. As we say so often at Pivot 613, the life that we're pursuing is not one that we create on our own. It is not that one that we manufacture and sustain on our own. In order that we make simple lives a fundamental and lasting change, we have to do what Jesus prescribes. Take the focus off of ourselves and put it on God. Because with God's perspective, we start to see the world as it truly is. We start to face the challenge of wealth or the challenge of lack from a completely different viewpoint. And so my hope and prayer is that everybody listening to me would find your simple center in God. That's all I have to say.